everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Jael Richardson, and I am joining you from Brampton, Ontario, Canada, where I serve as the Executive Director of the Festival of Literary Diversity. But today is not about that work. Today, I'm talking to you about my novel Gutter Child and providing you with just a little bit of information and background about the writing of the book, and then opening it up to some questions. So to start with, I just want to let you know that Brampton is actually located on the unceded territories of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples, as well as the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And for me, mentioning those names and learning to pronounce them and speaking them is really important because my ancestors are actually from tribes and communities that I don't know. Because of the slave trade, I don't have a sense of where my history is and where my people are actually from before the United States. And so it's really important for me to remember names and places and the original peoples of a land, because for me, that serves as a reminder of the consequences of displacement, the way the land can be left without its people, or with fewer of its people, and the way people can be left without land. And I think it's just a really important reminder for us to think about our individual stories, the places we come from, the lands we come from, the places to which our people are from, and to really question how we do things differently going forward, so that we can be better caretakers of the land and better people to the people around us. So today, my plan is to go through a chat for about 10 to 15 minutes about the beginnings of writing Gutter Child, the middle of writing Gutter Child, and the ending, which is always something people want to talk about. I should warn you, there will be spoilers. So if you haven't read the book, this is not the event for you. This is a conversation specifically designed for teachers and classes that have been studying the book, or students who have been individually studying the book. So I'm going to walk you through some of that history, that background, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. So you can put those questions in the box whenever you like. I do have some questions that students have asked in the past that I'll go to as well. And that'll kind of give us a little bit of a well-rounded look at not only Gutter Child and the writing of Gutter Child, but also a little bit about the writing process in general. I know oftentimes when I do these events, there are always students out there who are thinking, I think I might like to write a book. And so I'll talk a little bit about process as well. Okay. So to begin with, I'll start at the very beginning with the idea for Gutter Child. A lot of times people ask me, where do I get my ideas? Where do my inspiration come from? For me, writing is a very inspired process. It's not something I can sort of force or assign myself to do. It's something where the ideas kind of come, and then I really just have to go forward with them. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. So I was actually, the making of Gutter Child started when I was working on my very first book, which is The Stone Thrower. And The Stone Thrower is a memoir about my father's life. He was the first Black quarterback in Canada to win the Grey Cup, which is like the Super Bowl of the Canadian Football League. And so I was working on that book about his life for like personal family reasons, right? It wasn't because I wanted to be a writer and this needed to be my first book. That wasn't initially why I went into it. I initially wrote The Stone Thrower because I felt like it was important for my family to have a record of my dad's story. My dad was an only child. My grandparents had both passed away. And I thought, if I don't ask my dad these questions, who will know the answers when my son is born? And so that was the impetus behind writing The Stone Thrower. I went to a writing school, a graduate program to write The Stone Thrower, and I worked on that book. And that book really forced me to dig into some history. I was looking into the civil rights movement. I was looking into important historical characters like Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. And in looking through their stories, I started to see these patterns that were really troubling, that I really was starting to wrestle with, about systems of oppression, about government, and how laws are made, how laws are broken, what happens when certain people break the law. And these were all really fascinating questions to me. And by the time I was finished The Stone Thrower, the idea for Gutter Child really came about. And the idea for Gutter Child, based on that research I was doing, was, first of all, I wanted to write fiction. And I picked dystopian because first of all, I was so tired of doing research. So in dystopian, I felt like, oh, I could make the sky purple. I can make the ground blue. Like, you can do whatever you want with a dystopia because you are building the world. So that felt very freeing after being kind of restricted to truth and nonfiction. And I also picked dystopia because I had this question. And the question that I began Gutter Child with was, what happens when you grow up in a world that's designed for your failure? When do you know about it? And what do you do about it? Those were the three questions that were on my mind the entire time I was working on Gutter Child. What happens when you grow up in a world that's designed for your failure? When do you realize it? And what do you do about it? And that really shaped the majority of the world building and the story, because I was intentionally designing a world that was designed for the failure of some and the success of others, which is kind of how I see the real world, but whatever, that's a whole other thing. And so Gutter Child for me was a bit of an experiment to see, could I build a world that was designed for the failure of some? And when would they figure it out? And what would they do about it? And the other question is, like, could they tear it down? I was not successful in that last question, but that's a whole, I'll talk about that when we get to the ending. So those were the really key questions. The things I knew right from the outset, right as soon as Stone Thrower got signed off on and I started working on Gutter Child, I knew right away about the scars. That was probably the first visual thing that I knew was going to be a part of the book, that there was going to be these characters that had scars on their hands. And then the debt became also really important. And the debt was tied to the scars, obviously, but those two pieces formed two really critical parts of the story. One was what happens when it is visually noticeable that you are different and that you are a part of a community that is oppressed, overlooked, facing subjugation. So what happens when you can visually see that someone is a part of that kind of a community? The second one was with the debt, was what happens when you carry the weight of history? What happens when it's a physical part of your body, something other people can't see, and something that comes in greater or lesser amounts depending on what family you're from? So in Gutter Child, people are assigned debt at birth, and the debt is something that's passed on. So it, for me, was about sort of the weight of history as well, the way generation after generation, I still felt these kinds of pressures as a Black woman, even though I was living in considerable privilege in Canada. And so I wanted to figure out this way of representing the debt as a way of sort of saying, some characters are carrying more than others, but all of them are carrying something. So those are the two pieces I had at the beginning. And honest to goodness, I probably didn't have very much else. I knew Elamina was going to be the central character. I knew that she was going to have lived somewhere else and have ended up inside the system once again, because I knew that in the question of what happens when you grow up in a world that's designed for your failure and when do you realize it, if you're living inside of it, you can realize it pretty early, and you can realize it more and more as you get older. If you're living in a situation where finances are tight, you'll know it when you're small, and you'll know it more and more as you get older. So it was important for me that Elamina had been removed from knowing that information, and then at the start of the novel is able to enter in, because the novel is told in first person present, which allows me and allows Elamina to go into this place and to learn what's happening and what the system is along with the reader. And I really liked that framing. I liked the fact that I think she's about 13, 14 going into Livingstone Academy, but then she meets other people who know more about the system than her, and the reader can kind of gain that information along the way. So that's a really great example for me of how writing works. You sort of start, I think the best novels start with a question rather than a statement. If you say, I want to represent racism, or I want to show how powerful women are, your book can be kind of boring and dry, or it can kind of feel preachy. But if you ask yourself a question like, what would happen if there were no women in power? Wait, we live like that. No, I'm just, but what would happen if there were only women in power? And I want to imagine a world where that's happening. What would happen if women weren't allowed to have children, right? These are the kinds of questions that can lead you to a really great idea and a great book, because you're approaching it from a place of like, I don't know what the answer is. And that was a challenge for me with Gutter Child in terms of the ending, which I'll get to, is I had these questions and I actually couldn't answer all of them by the time I got to the end of the novel. And that represented for me a bit of an internal struggle with what's going on in the world, but also just the way writing works. Sometimes you don't actually finish a book and have all the answers. Oftentimes you don't. So, yeah, those are the main things I started the book with. I also had a really good sense of those 5 characters. So Elamina, David, Josephine, Violet, and Rowan. I had a good sense of those 5 characters because I felt like they kind of represented important people who would approach that question differently. What happens when you grow up in a world that's designed for your failure, and what do you do about it? Becomes very different for Elamina, David, Josephine, Violet, and Rowan. And it's a result of like those different, baggage, debts, those different experiences that they're carrying into the situation. And that was really something that I was excited to explore. So that kind of brings me to the middle of the book and some of the challenges in writing this book. The biggest challenge for me in writing this book is that I did not know how to write dystopia, and I had never written a novel before. So there were so many things that I had to learn. One of the things that's a real challenge with dystopias is that the joy is that you get to make up everything you want. The challenge is you make up everything you want, and therefore there's so many options and so many things that you have to figure out. Oftentimes, for me, there's a big question of like, how do you release information without like dumping it on the reader? How do you tell people about the world and the gutter system without just like plopping it into the first chapter? And one of the things that I do as a cheat, and this is a recommendation I make if you're doing a school project or assignment, if you're writing a novel, if you're writing a book, is always have a buddy book. And a buddy book for me is a book that I keep alongside me, that I open up and look at for examples of like what to do and how to do it. So one of the books that was really helpful for me in writing Gutter Child was Hunger Games. I love Hunger Games. And so I would actually look at the Hunger Games and I'd be like, okay, so one of the big backstories in the Hunger Games, if you haven't seen it, or read it, is what happens to District 12 and like how they end up in these districts and this system. And I wanted to know when that information starts to come out, and does it come out all at once, or is it kind of dripped out chapter by chapter? And if so, how? And so I would open up Hunger Games and I would look at how that was treated. And then I would sort of gauge how I wanted to do that with Gutter Child. And I would make sure that I kind of knew, okay, I don't want to go longer than like 2 or 3 chapters before I give a bit of the backstory, but I also want to kind of keep some of the backstory for a little bit later, because I don't want it all to come out at one time, because that makes it really heavy and really busy. So that's kind of how I handled those challenges. And one of the things that I did, a mistake that I made in terms of process, is when you're writing a book, oftentimes you can get really obsessed with chapters 1, 2, 3, 4. And depending how long the book's, like the first few chapters. And it's because it's really exciting and you're really kind of learning how to write. And so you'll go to chapters 1, 2, 3, then you'll come up with an idea for chapter 4 that makes you want to go back to chapter 1 and kind of fix it and make it smoothed out. And for about 4 years, so I was working on Gutter Child for 8 years. So about the first 4 years, I was seesawing back and forth between chapters 1 and maybe 6, 7, 8. And it just kept going back and forth and figuring things out. I hadn't really gotten to the end at all. And one of the things that I went to a writing retreat, and the writing instructor told me a layered process. And she said, when I write a book, I write cover to cover every time I work on the book. So I work on beginning to end. If I don't know how something works, I'll skip it and go to the next thing, and I'll fill that in later. And so that's how I started to work on the book in the latter 4 years. I started to work from beginning to end with every draft. And every time I went back to the beginning, I tackled a new thing. So instead of with each and what I was doing before, trying to perfect each sentence more and more and more as I went through. Every time I went through, perfect sentence, more perfect sentence, more perfect sentence, never getting to the ending. I started to just focus on one thing. So filling in the plot, making sure timelines were consistent was another read through. Making sure the dialogue was consistent, making sure the characters had a good arc. So I would go through the manuscript layer by layer instead of trying to perfect each chapter as I went. And that process was just life-changing because it made it so that I was able to work on things faster, or at least it felt that way. But I was also more focused every time I went through rather than feeling kind of overwhelmed. I got really comfortable, and I'm very comfortable with the fact that my drafts are actually kind of bad on a level. Like there's bad writing in them because I'm just not worried about whether it sounds good or it's perfect sentence structure or whatever in those earlier layers. I'm just trying to get the story out. And it allows me to feel more confident with where the ending is too. When you're constantly working beginning to end on a novel, you're constantly thinking about the beginning, the middle, and the end and making sure they work together. I was recently asked what makes for a good ending. And I'll talk about my ending in a minute, but what makes for a good ending. And one of the things is that the ending is both exactly where it's supposed to be, but also a little bit of a surprise, right? That's kind of the magic conclusion. And I think you can only do that well if you've consistently been thinking about the beginning, the middle, and the end, as opposed to, I know most students, when you're writing an essay or a story, you'll be like writing. The struggle is starting. The struggle is getting to the middle. The struggle is finishing. And by the time you get to that last line, it's like submit in. And you haven't really gone back to edit and restructure. And editing and restructuring are the most important parts of any writing process. I have nephews that are in university. My son is in his last year of middle school. And it's really, really, really important to edit well. And this process of layering allowed me to edit better. And I can see it improving even more with a novel that I'm starting now, which is, I'm doing this from the very beginning, whereas Gutter Child, I sort of halfway found this process. And so I highly recommend when you're working on an essay or a story, get to the end as fast as possible, even if the middle is terrible, and then continue to go through it in layers so that you're constantly thinking about, does this make sense? Does it read well? Am I bored somewhere in the middle? If you're bored somewhere in the middle of your own writing, there's something wrong with the story or the writing, and fix it. That's just a lesson I've learned. That's my process. And I'll say just technically wise, I used Word for most of Gutter Child. I now use a system called Scrivener, which is a writing program that's a little bit easier to move chapters around and work on timelines a little bit easier. But I literally will type all of my drafts beginning to end. And I'll type them right into the computer from the beginning, and then I'll print them and edit them by hand. And then I'll go back and work through the documents. So by the time I'm done a book, by the time I was done Gutter Child, I probably had 17 drafts in my folder because each draft was like a different layer, a different thing that I was working on. And sometimes there were like sub layers where I was like halfway through, I'm like, I don't like what I'm doing. I'm going to start over, but I'm also going to save it. So that's kind of the process I work, is I just save each draft separately so that if I cut something and I want to go back to it, there's actually a record of what was there before. And also so I can just see a little bit of the progress as well. So endings. I've talked a little bit about arriving at a really good ending. And the truth about Gutter Child is that I actually had a very different ending. There was a whole other chapter on the end of the book, right up until the very last minute. And I finished writing Gutter Child in May 2020, June 2020, July 2020. That's when I was finishing it up. And as you're probably aware, that was a time of great upheaval on multiple layers. Of course, it was the beginnings of COVID. It was also May 2020 was the month where George Floyd was murdered. And for me, George Floyd's murder was, of course, a big deal. It was a global issue, but it also come on the backs of the murder of Breonna Taylor, and some of the other events that have been going. Ahmaud Arbery was, I think, February of that year. And so for me, I was watching all these events, and George Floyd was kind of like a tipping point. And I was really struggling with what was going on in the world, with what had happened to these people. And I was struggling with writing a book like Gutter Child. Honestly, I was struggling with giving something like that out to the world. But I was also thinking, okay, maybe this is what I was meant to do and meant to write at this time. I just got to accept that. And but I did not feel good about the ending. I felt like it was a little too neat, a little too wrapped up, and a little too, I think it simplified the story in a way that I just wasn't comfortable with. And I also was not comfortable with writing like 10 more chapters and making it a much longer book. So I decided to take off the last chapter and to end the book where it does with Elamina and DJ. And when I did that, I actually felt really good. Like it felt right. And a lot of writing is instinct. And the challenge for me is that my editor, my agent were both white women who I love, but who couldn't quite identify with what I was going through. So it was a bit of a lonely process in wrestling with what was going on in the world, wrestling with this book that I was writing, and wrestling with what I was giving people. Like what were people going to think when they got to that ending? And most people were like, I want to know what happens. Like, I want to know more. But there was also a couple of readers, all Black women, who read it and really liked the way it ended, really liked the kind of question that invited people to ask. And I think that made me feel really comfortable, because by the time I had got to the end of the book, I had thought I would have resolution. I thought I would know and understand or have some like optimism about the world maybe. And I didn't. I felt very pessimistic. I felt very angry. And I decided to leave the book ending the way it did, because I felt like it was important for us to ask questions about what ending we would want. What would we want for Elamina at the end of Gutter Child, and why? And I think it's such a critical question to ask yourself when you get to the end. To people who've gotten very angry with me with the ending, I've said, like, why are you so angry? And are you as angry about where I've left Elamina as you are with where we are left right now in the world? Are you as angry about that? Because a novel is a novel and real life is kind of sucking right now. So are you as angry about that? And I'm not obligated to give a happy ending or a clear ending. And I don't typically like, as a reader, a vague ending. So I feel you. Like, I know what it's like to get to an ending and be like, that's not fair. But I also feel like it was really important to ask yourself, there's a lot of things that aren't fair right now. And what am I doing about it? And how is this book making me think differently about it? Maybe. So that's really why the ending is the way it is. I feel very good about it. There's also a note at the beginning as well that you may have seen about, just kind of like a warning that the book deals with hard subjects. And I also added that in 2020 because I felt like, oh, people could really use like a romance novel right now, or like a happy ending, a clear happy ending. And I'm just not able to do that. So, like, fair warning. And so those were things I'm very proud of, because when I look back on the book, it always reminds me that this was 2020 and that it came out at this particular moment, and that it was probably needed at that particular moment. But I recognize that there's not universal excitement about the ending. I will say that I am working on a sequel. So as soon as I decided to cut that chapter, the last chapter, and as soon as I read the book, as I said, I knew that was the right ending. But I also knew I wasn't done with asking the questions, and I wasn't done figuring out what happened. So I have spent the last few years since Gutter Child came out working on a sequel. I'm very excited about it. It's very hard. It has not gotten any easier. The ending, I think, is going to be even more difficult, because I really feel like this is the last one. And so I have to kind of find that ending that is both satisfying and surprising, which is a challenge. But that's kind of where I'm at right now. I think this is a good time to move to questions. So if you have any questions and you're watching, you can just pop them in the question and answer box. And I'm going to pull a few questions that I've received from students over the past few months, and just ones that I've been thinking about. So, does writing energize or exhaust you? That's a question I've got. Does writing energize or exhaust me? I think it's both, really. There are certain times in the process where writing really energizes me and makes me feel motivated and excited. I think as soon as I'm finished a book, I feel really energized to write the next one, ironically. And I really like to do that right away. I like to write the next book and start plotting it out before the one before it comes out, because I think you're at your most free then and you feel the most optimistic. It can be really hard to start writing if you've completed a book and it hasn't done particularly well, or it hasn't met the targets that you want it to have. And I think when you're already underway with a new project and something goes badly, you're just like, meh, I'm already like halfway through this book. So that's a moment where I'm really excited. I'm really energized. I feel really free. The exhausting part is the editing part and the looking like really closely and the asking the hard questions. That's exhausting because you're held accountable to things, and that's just tough. It's just tough to work through hard questions you don't know how the answers to. People often ask me if I believe in writer's block, or like, what do I do about writer's block? And I don't really believe in writer's block, but I do believe that we put time pressures on ourselves, and those can make us feel like we have to write faster than our minds are ready. So I think, like I said, writing is a lot about instinct. And if you're writing for a deadline, it can feel really stressful and like you're not writing for instinct, you're writing to like hit a target. So for me, I try and keep my targets really like distant, and I move them if I need to. Because writing isn't just when I'm on the computer or when I'm on the page. It's also when I'm like on the bus or on the train or walking in my neighborhood. It's watching, it's reading, it's watching TV, I was watching a documentary last night, and I feel like I have a new idea for my novel that was very helpful. That's writing too. And so if you can't figure out a solution to something, sometimes it just needs time. It needs you to watch things, read things, percolate on things, rather than just plowing through for a deadline. So in the question of writer's block, I don't really believe in writer's block unless you have a deadline that you have no flexibility in. So if you have a school project and they're saying like, write, do this, and you're like, that can be writer's block because you're just not ready, or the idea is not quite ready. And in that case, you just have to fake it till you make it, unfortunately, if it's a school assignment. Okay, some really great questions have come in. So this is a great question. I get lots of questions about characters. I love character-based questions. So this one's about Rowan and male toxicity. Does he ever understand how damaging his behavior towards Elamina was or is? Rowan is a really fun character to write. I will say he is in the sequel. And so I won't say too much about that, like in a direct answer to that question in some ways, but I will say, I think that his behavior for me is a product of a system. And I'm really empathetic towards Rowan. And I would encourage, as readers, his behavior is bad. And I think the question with all of the characters, both bad and good, is why. A lot of people that I've met at book clubs don't like Rowan. Some actually like Rowan and feel really bad for him and don't like David, which I find very surprising. But I think it's really important to ask yourself, like, why do I like this character? Why am I so angry at this character? Why is this character so painful for me? Or why do I really enjoy this character? And what might that be related to in my own life? I think Rowan for me represents, David's kind of based on my dad, and Rowan's kind of like the counter, the opposite. A lot of the players when I was researching my dad's life, who were also first Black man to start in the NFL, first Black boxer, like first, all these firsts were really struggling with a lot of the same things my dad was struggling with, but dealing with them in different ways. A lot of them turned to alcohol and drugs, and many of them, even if they had success in their sport, found problems once they retired. And so it was really about looking at those two different ways of coping as a man in a world that's designed for your failure. Not that there's only two different ways, but those two particular ways. And so, yeah, what was Rowan's thought process when he did those things to Elamina? I think he's a person who's, searching for love and searching for affection and searching for acceptance. And he's one of the characters who's doing it many times in the wrong ways. and he's just trying to survive. And I think if you look at people trying to survive in a world that's designed for their failure, many of them are doing it in different ways. Some of them are turning to things that aren't good. Some of them are deciding, like, I'm just going to ignore everyone around me and focus on my own thing. I'm going to hopefully find my way out. Violet, she's doing all the right things. Unlike Rowan, she's doing all the right things in a lot of ways, and still finding hurdle after hurdle after hurdle. So, like, what happens to you when that's happening? And yeah, I think it's tough. What point of view is your sequel in? Oh, this is a great question. Thanks for asking. The sequel is actually, so one of the things I do when I'm writing a book is I always look at point of view and tense, so verb tense, as a key part of like what the story is about and how the story needs to be told. So for me, Gutter Child had to be told in first person and had to be told by Elamina in order for the reader to learn or work through the questions I was working through. What happens when you find out that you're born in a world that's designed for your failure? It had to be a single person who didn't understand being taught what's happening. That was automatic. So with the sequel, I felt quite different. I felt like it didn't and shouldn't actually be Elamina narrating in first person and carrying into the same story. So actually the sequel is told by multiple narrators at this point. Actually, that's a lie. It's told by one narrator from multiple characters' perspectives. So there is a third person narrator, and they look at the story from each 10 different characters' perspectives, and each character appears 3 times. This is the current structure. My editor has not really read it, so who knows if that will stay. But I'm really excited about that because craft-wise, it gave me something new to learn and work through. And that's probably been the most exciting part, talking about energized versus exhaustion. I've been very energized by finding my way in this new voice and this new approach. What is your inspiration to write such a thought-provoking story? What did you plan for people to understand from Gutter Child? Great question. So I think my inspiration was looking at the civil rights movement and looking at how long it took to get some very basic rights, and how when I look at capitalism and even democratic countries, I see them as systems that are designed for the success of some and the failure of others. And I see them as ultimately failing and failed processes. And so I wanted to think through that on my own, removed from names like Canada or United States or wherever country I was thinking about. I wanted to kind of create my own world and navigate those questions. And I think what I hoped people understood, ultimately, I hope there was a deeper perspective on racism in a lot of ways. I think it's a hard concept, especially when in talking specifically about the Black community. It's very hard for people to understand. And I'll share it this way. I chose dystopia because I needed to be able to remove some of the pieces in our real world that make things complicated. For example, if you're a Black person who is from Nigeria, or you are a Black person who is from Brazil, or you're a Black person who's from Jamaica or from Canada, those are very different experiences. And actually the shade of your skin can also change each of those experiences. And I couldn't navigate all the complexities of that. And I didn't want to limit the experience to the experience of a Black Canadian or a Black American or someone from Nigeria or Brazil or Jamaica. I wanted to kind of talk about things that I feel are very universal. And so dystopia allowed me to like pull out all of the specifics of nation. And there's a little bit of shadeism in the book, but specifically nation and specific lands that we're familiar with, and allow me to focus on some of the topical issues of race and racism that we see explored in many, especially colonized countries. And so, I think that I hoped people would have a deeper understanding of that very complex topic by pulling it out of the specifics and kind of leaving it a little more broad. When we look at the people on the hill versus people born in the gutter, can we see the differences between what it means to be middle class and upper class, lower class? Can we talk about immigration and segregation? That's kind of the things I wanted people to think about. And I never hope that people come to the end of the book with a simple conclusion or a singular answer to the many problems. I hope actually that they're just more confused and asking more questions in some ways, because I think we often go back to books that force us to ask more questions than we do books that give us all the answers. First of all, thanks, Ms. Cornwall, for all these, some of these really great questions. I'm getting a few from different places, but yours were great. How did you create such cinematic characters that intertwine with each other, and what influence do each of them mirror individually? Example, is it true that Rowan has a black bull archetype referring to slavery? I've never had that question, and I don't know if I have an answer to that. So thank you. I think the 5 characters were really exciting to think about, because it was exciting to kind of pull out different approaches. And a lot of people ask me sort of who I base characters on, or what are they based on real people? And oftentimes they're based on parts of real people. Ida is definitely based a lot on my grandmother. I read it and I just think of my grandmother every time. And then I think the girls are actually like different parts of me. I think there's some parts of me that I'm like Violet, some ways in which I'm like Elamina, and there are ways in which I kind of aspire to be more like Josephine. So I think that's what's fun about writing in general. Sorry. That's what's fun about writing in general, is that you get to play around with like what you might do or what might happen to you in a given situation. And having them talk to each other is kind of like, if I was a little bit more bold or brave, what would I say to myself who's not particularly brave? And how might that change the way things go? What might the counterbalance to being brave be? Maybe that's like more careful, more thoughtful, whatever it is. So I think creating great characters is a challenge, but it's also like one of the things that invigorates me. I actually love all the girls at Miss Charlotte's house. That whole grouping, scenes, stories was probably my favorite bit to write. Yeah. Did you have any hesitation about publishing this story? If so, why did you go through with it? Partway through writing the book, I thought the book was really terrible. In that 4-year period, I actually stopped writing the book for a year and started to like plan for another book, because I was just like, this is a terrible idea and I'm going to be embarrassed when it comes out. And then like, what do I do? So I tried to avoid writing it, and the book just wouldn't stop. It just wouldn't stop. The characters would not leave me alone. And so eventually I resolved to just finish the book, put it away, and then write something else after and not ever publish it. And then I got to the end of it and I kind of liked it. I was kind of proud of it. And so I decided to share it with my agent and then with publishers. And actually, the book got rejected by 3 publishers asked for the book, and 2 of them rejected it. And 1 accepted it. And the great thing about that is the same thing happened with my agent. I got rejected by 2 or 3, and then my agent came through. Is I knew who wanted me, who wanted it. And that turned out to be a really good fit, but it is hard to get that kind of rejection. It is hard to like wonder why. And sometimes, Gutter Child did pretty well. And so that's great validation, but sometimes that doesn't happen. And I think you have to recognize that writing always has to be like your instinct, your passion, because it's very unlikely it'll pay the bills. So I think that was ultimately, you have to trust, like I trust my agent, my editor to say like, this is a good book. We're going to put it out there and we're going to be really excited about it because it's a really great book. And so you have to kind of believe that and then trust that even when things don't go perhaps amazing on the other side. Why do you use the color red? And what does it mean? And what other colors do you use in the book? So red, red and green are probably my favorite colors on a secret, like just private, day-to-day level. When I got married, my bridesmaids wore green. And red, I just love the way it feels when I wear red. But I think red is such a it's such an aggressive color, and that is in a book, you want certain things to stand out, like the red coats and the red lipstick, Miss Femia's red lipstick. And I think there's something else red that I remember being like, is it too much red? But I think that they're really important colors to stand out. Like if you think about a campus full of kids wearing all gray and white and just kind of dull, bland colors, and then two people are wearing this red, like that's a big deal. And it doesn't have, for me, the same impact if it's yellow or green or blue. Like red is saying something very aggressive that I like. And so I often use red for like something I want to be like, whoa, whoa, something's happening there. There are a few other places where I pick colors. Like I'll often use like purple's and a one that I use, but oftentimes colors mean something. So purple for me often means royalty. Gold and yellow, depending, can often mean something a little softer, a little calmer. So the reality is you pick a color that matches what you're trying to do, what you're trying to approach. If someone's holding a green mug, it might be because you want it, and you might describe there's so many different shades of green, right? When you're describing green, I think there's a green cup at one time Miss Templeton's holding, and that's because I was trying to look at mugs. For me, the book is written kind of in the 70s. That's kind of like the time zone vibe that I was bringing in. So I found this really thick mug that was very common in the 70s, and it was this like mint green. And so sometimes I'll describe something like that to like place us in time or to give us a mood. So that's usually how I pick any color that someone's wearing. If I describe someone as wearing like a blue shirt or a green shirt or yellow or red, like there's some reason behind it usually. Yeah. Okay, so those are some of the questions. I'm going to wrap up with two questions that have come in. And one is about favorite or preferred genre. So a lot of people ask, like, do I want to write dystopia forever? Is it what I read? I actually read across the board, and I think it depends on my mood. It depends on where I'm going, what I'll be doing when I get there. I do love contemporary fiction and contemporary dystopia. Those are really fun for me to read, and I tend to read those the fastest. I also really like thrillers and romance novels. And then I read literary fiction, which is kind of the heavier, meatier, sometimes a slower read. Those ones are tricky, though. I have to have kind of the right space and the right mood for literary fiction. And I do that a few times a year. So I usually save it for those periods. My next book. So after I finish the sequel for Gutter Child, I think I want to try my hand at some version of a psychological thriller, like a Get Out type book. That's kind of my like secret hope, now shared publicly with everyone. So we'll see what happens with that. And then my last thing that I'll share is just kind of my advice for people in finishing up high school and going into their 20s. I think for me, what I always recommend is really explore your passions and think about what you love doing and also what you can do day to day. So for me, I knew that writing, I didn't know I was going to be a writer until after I got out of university. And my plan was to actually be a college professor. And so that's why I went to do my master's, and I wrote The Stone Thrower as part of my master's thesis, because I thought ultimately I'll have a book, but really what I want to do is teach in college. And that was kind of my goal. Turns out I decided to start a charity, and that's what I do as my full-time job alongside writing. So things will change. And my biggest advice is just to not worry too far down the road. Like, don't worry about what job you're going to have when you're 30, 35, or 40, because by the time you get to 30, 35, or 40, you'll be kind of a different person. And what you may want to do and what you may like doing may change. And you can see that, ask any of your teachers. Some of them will go from teaching into becoming a librarian. Some of them will go work for the board. Some of them will, take on different jobs or pause teaching for a while. There's all kinds of changes that will happen. And I think if you kind of focus on your life in smaller chunks, it can actually bring you a little bit more peace, a little bit less anxiety about like, what am I doing in the world and what am I going to do in the world and how can I make this huge difference? I think I am 42 years old and I started to make an impact in my community like in my mid 30s. and into my 40s now. And I had no idea that I would be doing this job and these types of things at this time. And so my advice is like to worry less about what's 10, 20 years down the road and kind of focus on those 5-year blocks. The other thing I would advise you to do is just this is a really practical one. That was a bit of a philosophical one. I'll give you a more practical one to wrap up, is to just be really good with money. If you're working right now, if you have a part-time job, my son, what we do with him is, 40 to 50% of his paycheck, whatever he gets paid, goes into savings, and 10 goes to a charity, and 40 to 50% is his to spend at will. No questions. And I think if you build up a practice where you're saving as much or more than you're spending, you get into a really good habit of not spending more than you make. And the 20s can be really tricky because a lot of what's supposed to be fun about the 20s involves having money, and you don't always have it. People want to travel and they want to do all these things, but like that involves money. You want to go out for dinner with your friends, and that involves money. So I think being really good and really, really responsible with your money allows you to kind of enjoy your 20s. And then the hope is that by the time you get to your 30s, you haven't just spent all your money doing whatever that you've saved and spent. So finding a really good relationship and a really good understanding of money is important. And another thing to look at as you do that is ask yourself, did I grow up in a household that was really good with money? In what ways was my family good with money? In what ways aren't they good with money? And how can I do things better? Because having a good relationship with money allows you a little more flexibility in the choices you make. If you want to go back to school, if you want to change jobs, and you have a little bit in savings, it's a little bit less stressful if you've just been putting it all out there for your cell phone or for a car or for whatever it is that you think you should have. Just be responsible. So thank you so much for joining me and for watching this. And thank you to all of the teachers who have shared this book with their classes. I truly wish I could do more virtual and in-person events in schools. And it breaks my heart that I can't do it more often. But I did a little ways back decide, fold and writing were going to be the keys right now for me. And with a family, it's just, I'm just not able to do it as often as I like. So I hope you find this helpful. I hope your classrooms are blessed from having Red Gutter Child. I hope they're challenged. I hope the discussions are rich. And I certainly hope to see you out in the world someday. Thank you so much for being here. Bye.